Dzień dobry Państwu, witam niezwykle serdecznie wszystkie osoby, które są tutaj w Centrum Konferencyjnym hotelu Sheraton, które przyszły na spotkanie, na wykład zatytułowany "Co po Unii Europejskiej? Europa w połowie XXI wieku". Wykład przeprowadzi pan profesor George Friedman, ale o przedstawienie naszego gościa poproszę panią Beatę Mońkę, prezeskę Kanału Plus. Kanał Plus jest partnerem tego spotkania, ponieważ zajmuje się wszystkim, co ciekawe, a właśnie wyzwania stojące przed Europą są również leżą również w zainteresowaniu nas wszystkich, także Kanału Plus. Zapraszam Beatę Mońkę.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Będę mówiła w języku polskim. Zgodził się na to pan dr George Friedman. I just said that Mr. Friedman has agreed to, when I will be speaking in Polish, and he said to me that he trusts me, that these things that I will say in Polish will be not just about what Polish thinks about Americans, but the real story why, first of all, Canal Plus decided to take care about this event, and short introduction of Mr. Friedman. Więc przede wszystkim myślę, że sylwetki pana Friedmana nie trzeba przedstawiać. Wszyscy wiemy, że jest wspaniałym amerykańskim politologiem, ekspertem w dziedzinie stosunków międzynarodowych. Jego poruszające książki możecie Państwo kupić na stoisku, tak będę promować. Jedną z nich zresztą tutaj mam. I myślę, że najtrafniej można przedstawić pana George'a krótkim też cytatem z tejże książki. Tak powiedział o nim San Antonio Express News. Friedman nie rości żadnych wielkich pretensji. Wrzuca tylko swoją geopolityczną wiedzę do szklanej kuli. Biorąc jednak pod uwagę, jak wiele jego prognoz sprawdziło się przez te lata, warto go słuchać. Dlaczego Kanal Plus postanowił objąć patronat nad tym wydarzeniem? Dlatego, że wszystko, co czasami wydaje się trudne, co polaryzuje, a co pobudza do dyskusji, jest nam bliskie. W związku z tym, panie doktorze, tutaj myślę, że mamy wspólny mianownik. Ja z wielką przyjemnością zapraszam Państwa na wykład doktora Friedmana. Dziękuję.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and honored to have a chance to give my views on Europe to Europeans. This is, of course, a dangerous thing to do, but many Europeans have given Americans advice on how to run their country, so this is my turn. I said that I'm American, but that is not altogether true. I was born in Hungary in 1949. This was a very bad time to be born in Hungary. My parents left when I was 6 months old because the People's Republic had been declared and they had to leave or bad things would happen. They escaped to America, a place where all things are possible. But my childhood was a European childhood. We spoke only Hungarian. And around the dinner table, the conversation was about the dead, the missing, and how it all happened. And I remember that in 1956, living in New York, when the tanks rolled into Budapest, my mother was watching television and recognized their house on Kazinczuca being shelled by tanks. So I lived a dual childhood. From my Hungarian side, I grew up with a dread of the past and a fear of the future. The thing that I learned from my parents was that nothing you can imagine might be as bad as history turns out to be. That all of your hopes have no meaning. That history would define for you what your life is or isn't. In the United States, I went to school and I learned that all things were possible. I was told that I could be anything I wanted to be. my country could become anything it wished to be, and I lived in the tension between these two realities. I never forgot my nightmares. I never forgot the promise, which made me a very difficult person to live with, as my children will tell you. But what I learned from my Hungarian life was that what I want, or what I fear, has little to do with what will happen. We people, after the Cold War, believe we will have meetings on policy, we will have working groups, papers even will be distributed, and out of this reality will arise. What I learned was that these things can happen, but it's much more complicated than that. History is not defined by what we wish. It is defined by the impossible. There are many things we can dream of, and the task that we have in predicting what will happen is to define what can't happen. What is a logical impossibility, a spiritual impossibility, a political impossibility. And when you have eliminated all those, ruthlessly and without sentiment and without wishful thinking, what is left, however impoverished and limited, is what is going to happen. When Europeans speak about the European Union, they think of the fact that there must be a solution. There must be a solution because we must have a solution, because not having a solution is unacceptable. It's a very American thinking. And there's nothing in Hungarian history or Polish history that says that the thing that must happen will happen. And there is, when I come to Europe, a sense of unreality, as when I go to Washington. And the unreality is this belief that because some solution is needed, some solution will occur. And this is the Americanization of Europe. At the same time that the Americans are learning the limits of what's possible, that merely because they want a democracy in Afghanistan does not mean there will be a democracy in Afghanistan. The Europeans are becoming Americans, believing that the solution they need will occur. Men who don't recognize their limits are dangerous. The 20th century was a century in which there were men leading important countries who thought there were no limits, who had no prudence, who would stop at nothing. It's important that we recognize that there are things that are impossible. It is not comfortable, it is not pleasant, but it's also not the end of the world. As I learned in Budapest, or for my Hungarian parents, it is the men who think that everything is possible and will do anything, slaughter anyone, to achieve it. Where are the dangers? Not those who say, well, this can't happen, let's try something else. In that modesty lies, I think, civilization. This is a teaching that the Europeans have been trying to tell the Americans for years, and we didn't listen well. Now I think it's time for the Europeans to start telling themselves that. To begin to think that some things can't happen, no matter how badly you want it to. So I will speak today not of possibilities, but of constraints. I will speak not of what I would like to see happen, but what I think will happen. And I will try to explain why I think that. And to do that, we have to think of Europe for a moment. And we have to think of Europe in its broadest historical sense. Because Europe in 2012 is merely one moment in an unfolding dialectic. It goes back 2,000 years, but we begin it in 1492. When Europe changed the human condition permanently. Up until then, The Chinese did not know the Aztecs. The Aztecs had no idea about the Zulus. The world lived divided. And the Europeans globalized the world. Beginning with the Iberian explorations, they shattered all of the mini-worlds that we consisted of and forced the entire world to know itself. It did it brutally. It did it selfishly. It did it violently. But at the end of the process, the human condition had changed from an enchanted world where strange people who we've never heard of lived into one world. That was globalization, not Dell Computer selling computers in South Africa. Globalization began with the violent intrusion of Europe on the world. And in 1900, Europe was a place of extraordinary power that dominated the world. Barbara Tuchman, American historian, wrote a book called The Proud Tower. It was about this moment, this highest moment of Europe, when not only was Europe extraordinarily prosperous, but there was no part of the world either not directly ruled by European power or influenced by it. Europe shaped the world. Yet there's always original sin, and Poland is a country I can speak about that. And the original sin of Europe was that even as it conquered the world, it had an endless, unsettlable civil war going on inside of Europe. The Portuguese against the Spaniards against the French against the British, finally the Germans against everyone. It was a world in which the European peninsula conquered the world, yet failed to create the unity of Europe. When we speak of the European Union, it must be in that context with that memory and of that massive failure. Because that failure cost Europe the world. From 1914 to 1945, following German reunification, the European wars that had gone on for almost 500 years culminated in a savagery almost unknown by human beings. Not merely Hitler, not merely Stalin, but Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, Tannenberg, places where lives were thrown away as if they were paper. And from 1914 to 1945, Europe was gripped with a madness. And the most important thing that came out of that, aside from me, was that Europe lost its empire. In 1900, it was unthinkable that the British and the French, even the Belgian Empire would disappear. By 1960, it was gone. And that ended 500 years of history. I have heard it said here and other places that since 1945, because of the European Union, Europe has avoided war. The history is a little different. From 1945 to 1991, Europe was occupied, directly occupied, 1989, directly occupied by the Soviets, and much more subtly occupied by the Americans. But the question of war and peace was not being made in Warsaw, Berlin, Rome. It was being made in Washington and Moscow. If there was going to be a European war, it was not going to happen because of a misunderstanding because of the French and the Germans. It was going to happen because of a decision between the Americans and the Soviets. And I want to say, that is fairly said, that the Americans and the Soviets behaved with a prudence and care from 1945 to 1991 that was really extraordinary. And something that I think Europeans rarely give them credit for. Had the diplomats of 1914 and 1939 been running the show, I wonder whether Europe would have avoided a war. But it was the great fortune of Europe at that point that its sovereignty was suspended. And that the decisions of war and peace, of life and death, were being made by Americans and the Soviets, who fully understood the consequences of war and were very careful. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, an extraordinary thing happened. For the first time in 500 years, not a single European power was a global power. Up until that point, there had always been a European power that could influence events in Asia, could influence events in the South Atlantic, whether it was Britain, whether it was Holland, whether it was Spain. For 500 years, almost to the day, there had been a European power. And now, for the first time, there was none. And the world had been reshaped in such a fundamental way that it became unrecognizable. In 1991, the United States became the only global power. Looking back on it, you may all say, well, we knew the Americans would win. But I can tell you that when we lost in Vietnam, we weren't all that clear we were going to win. It was only in 1991 that this unexpected empire fell on us. And we really didn't know what to do with it. And we still don't know what to do with it. And we certainly don't want to learn from the Europeans because they didn't do very well with it. Well, that's not true. You created a world, but you couldn't hold it. The European Union existed as a sovereign entity, I will argue, from 1991 to 2008. Its precursors certainly existed within the context of the Cold War, other relationships, but the period of the EU and its promise being fulfilled really began in 1991, not only because of Maastricht, but because of the end of the Cold War, where Europe no longer became a potential battleground of foreign powers, but regained its sovereignty. And it constructed this entity, which had been under construction before, and now took responsibility for it. And from 1991 to 2008, it was a period of unprecedented prosperity, stability, and everything you want. But I would argue that after the Congress of Vienna, there was such a period. A period in which it was announced that all of the nightmares of the French Revolution had been abolished and everything had returned to safety. And to me, the period of 1991 to 2008 was the easy part. There were 4 reasons for the construction of the EU. First, the Cold War. It grew out of the American Marshall Plan. It grew out of the American concept that in order to defeat the Soviets, a prosperous Western Europe was necessary, and the idea that somehow intensified trade would facilitate this. It is not that the Europeans didn't create it, but in a certain sense, the Americans sponsored it. The second purpose was to avoid war. It was the idea that if Germany was linked to France, was linked to other countries by prosperity, it wouldn't risk war. And given my nightmares, I fully understand any plan that intended to constrain, incentivize Germany. That's, of course, a wonderful idea. Later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was an instrument of democratization. If you democratize Ukraine, if you follow human rights, we will let you into a zone of prosperity that will transform your life. Given a choice between exclusion from this wondrous zone and the development of democracy, for most nations it was an easy choice, and they competed for the opportunity not only to be democratic, but to join an institution that would guarantee their democratic nature. And there was a fourth reason, an attempt by the Europeans to regain a global voice. It was hard for Germany or France by themselves to be heard, but not for Europe. The dilemma there was that Europe wanted a global voice, but it didn't speak with one. For every country, there was a different voice. And when we tried to ask the question, who speaks for Europe? Well, first the French would declare they do. The Germans would declare we don't. And I think there's a Croatian who speaks for Europe. We'll find him. But it was a vision that the weight of Europe could be felt again. But notice that this all assumed one thing: prosperity. The idea of the Cold War, the idea of uniting Germany and France, of the Democrat incentive to be democratic, the global voice, all assumed not only that there would be a European Union, but it would be prosperous, that would motivate people to work together, penalize people who didn't work together. And the fear was always the nightmare of the past, that the European past would return if this failed. And the dilemma was that it was all hung on the idea not only of a European Union, but a European Union that would incentivize everyone to behave with a civility that Europe had never quite managed in the past. The crisis of 2008, of course, was that the period in which the automatic prosperity of the European Union ended. It became hard. Now what had to happen was something different. The management of austerity, the distribution of pain. To countries, this is normal. It happens periodically. We Americans are going through it as well. And we're shouting and screaming and moaning and carrying on. But for the EU, the idea that a free trade zone of Europe would yield prosperity and stabilize the situation was the foundation. It was not the institutions that was the promise. It was the outcome of the institutions. And in 2008, as cyclically happens in capitalism, a crisis occurred. To this moment, the Europeans have not decided how to manage the crisis. It is said that they will shortly do so. It has been said for several years. At a certain point, it must be faced that the problem of Europe is not a trivial misunderstanding. It is not a matter of not having sufficient economic models to present at the next G8 summit, but a fundamental disagreement, to quote Lenin, of what is to be done. The problem of Europe is that its only consensus was prosperity. It has no consensus on austerity. But 2008 carried with it another event. And it's interesting because these events took place weeks apart. If the 2008 crisis can be marked financially as the fall of Lehman Brothers, a few weeks before, Russia returned to history. And I mean the Georgian War. And this is underestimated in terms of the impact on Europe and its meaning. The war itself was minor, as European wars go. The Russian performance was not magnificent, but it happened. I hear always saying we've avoided war. No, you didn't. You didn't avoid 2008. You didn't avoid Yugoslavia either, but I'll give you that one. But the Russians decided, for their own reasons, having little to do with Georgia and a great deal to do with Ukraine, a great deal to do with Germany, to demonstrate that they remained, unlike the Europeans, maybe poor, but a comprehensive power. That they could take military action, and far more important, that the Americans could do nothing about it. Between the financial crisis and the inability of NATO, which is the other European and Euro-American institution, to respond to the Russian war with Georgia, and we can discuss how it happened for a long time, there was a moment of extraordinary impotence, which appeared at first to be American. But as we see it more in historical perspective, was European, at least as well, and perhaps more. For the fate of Georgia and the Caucasus is surely a European problem. The status of Russia is surely a European problem. And the management of austerity is surely a European problem. Yet in those few weeks, in August and September of 2008, an era in European history ended. 1991 to 2008. The period in which the European Union, as a mature entity under the control of Europeans, functioned superbly and had to now face a world in which geopolitical questions did matter, to what extent was not yet clear, and which financial problems had to be settled and could not be settled without serious pain to someone. This was a normal condition for countries, from Argentina to the United States, but it posed an extraordinary challenge to Europe, a challenge that it's still trying to work out. Behind everything is the fear of the reemergence of nationalism, but I would argue that nationalism has reemerged. When the Europeans meet, the Greeks speak for the Greeks, the Germans for the Germans, the Spaniards for the Spaniards, and the bureaucracy claims to speak for everyone. But it's more complicated than that, because you can't speak for everyone, because as in any country, there must be losers. But something else has come out. What do we mean when we talk about nationalism? We mean, more than anything else, shared fate. I may be a Hungarian, if I were, and I may not like Hungary, but when the Wehrmacht comes in, I share the fate. It is not an elective affinity, as Goethe said. It is one that I'm born to. Out of that comes, from another dimension, love of one's own. I'm an American. I love America. And I like Americans. hard to understand, perhaps, but I live in Texas, and I'm comfortable, and I choose to be there. I love my own, and my fate is shared with them. And what happens to them happens to me, and their fate matters to me. And this is the foundation of community. Now, community is a very neutral term. We like community. But when there are enough of us, we call it nation. And for several hundred years, the nation has been the underlying unit of Europe. And the European Union has come along and tried to both preserve the nation and transcend it. Even Hegel couldn't figure out how to do this one. What does it mean in this context? If I'm a 25-year-old Greek, I am facing a world in which I may not have a job for the next 10, 15 years. I can't buy an apartment. I possibly can't get married. If anybody gets married anymore, I don't know. We speak of austerity in Europe in a very antiseptic way. It means the devastation of generations. For if you're 25 and you face 15, 20 years of austerity, which one of your hopes will be realized? Which one of your dreams? I'm speaking to Poles, so this is not a mystery. You understand a generation whose dreams are lost. The life of a Greek today will look very different from the life of a 25-year-old German who does not face that, who does not face an impoverished existence of limited possibilities, lost hopes, no dreams. In what sense are they part of the same community? The Greek experience of the next years will be fundamentally different from the German. Now, it may be said that the Greeks were irresponsible. I know German bankers, and I know that they're very careless, and they lend money to people not knowing whether they can pay it back or not. Deutsche Bank examiners are just casual people. I'm being cynical here in saying when the Germans claim that we were fooled, I'm immediately going to go to the Deutsche Bank and borrow money, because if they're that easy to fool, I admire them. Give me a loan. So I will say to an American, come on, guys. The Germans needed to maintain demand in the Eurozone. They had a credit policy to do so, and they used their banking system as a piggy bank and hollowed it out. The Greek answer is, why should we suffer a generational loss in order to stabilize the German banking system? And the Germans say, because we lent you money. And the Greeks say, you lent us money for your own reasons, not for ours. But this is a meaningless conversation, this debate. The fact is that at the extreme point of Europe, Greece versus Germany, there is no shared fate. There is no understanding that this burden is my burden to the extent that I will suffer with you. There is no love of one's own. I was in Greece recently, and I heard a great deal of contempt and rage. But love and admiration I didn't hear. And when I speak to Germans, I miss the same thing. And an interesting thing is they don't speak of the Greeks as Europeans. They call them Greeks. And the Greeks don't speak of the Germans as Europeans, they call them Germans. And sometimes they put words in front of that. And when the Spaniards meet the Germans, it is the Spaniards meeting the Germans. The rise of nationalism is inherent in pain. Nations are born of pain. And what this crisis has done is remind everyone of who they share their fate with and who they must turn to help them if they will. And this is the crisis of the European Union. It was somewhere between an alliance, it was more than that, and somewhere beneath a federation, because no one wanted to make that commitment to each other. And it hung between these two, supported only by prosperity. And in prosperity, you didn't have to ask these questions. And in 2008, the strings fell. And now we ask these questions. And part of Europe says these are not important questions and you shouldn't raise them. And I understand that. And part of Europe simply lives a nightmare that they never expected to be part of. This crisis has violated the social contract implicit in the European Union. A promise that should never have been made and was never prudent. Where Kant promised perpetual peace, the EU promised perpetual prosperity. Rather than promising blood, sweat, toil, and tears, it made a promise that could not be fulfilled. And now it is looking for a new basis for the social contract. And the answer is, it is to avoid war. It's a good answer. It's an important answer. But is it persuasive to a Spaniard who faces a life of penury? What the European Union tried to do was divide economics from the rest of human life. To create an economic union, but leave the other dimensions, the love, the passion, and these other things, in others' hands. But when the prosperity went away, when the economy didn't work, what was left? Out of all of this comes the perpetual European problem for the past century and a half, the German question. Ever since 1871, Europe had to face the fact that at the center of Europe was one of the most dynamic economic forces imaginable, but one profoundly insecure geopolitically. Sitting on the North European plain, surrounded in the east and the west by potential enemies, rich, powerful, creative, and quite frightened. The EU tried to take Germany and put it into Europe, and it worked. And now Germany has popped out again. Popped out not because there are evil men with mustaches with crazed theories, simply because Europe is finding it very difficult to contain Germany, and Germany is finding it very difficult to live with Europe. The Greeks want the Germans to pay to avoid a generational catastrophe, simply put. The Germans want the Greeks to suffer a generational catastrophe to stabilize the European banking system, or to keep it from becoming more unstable. But most important, we have at the center of the EU the world's third largest exporting power, behind China and just behind the United States. And this maintains a positive balance of trade. Where NAFTA is built around an importer, the United States, the European Union is built around an exporter that derives a huge amount of its GDP from exports and who sees the free trade zone as the arena in which some of its interests can be filled, and the euro as a mechanism for pricing its exports effectively within the region. At a time of prosperity, all of this was fine. But this is not a time of prosperity. The question for Germany now is, what is to be done? It must export. It cannot change that. Its structural economic format depends on that. And it must import energy. And so now we begin to look at the Germans. What will they do? And they have given an offer. We will save Europe with federation. And what does federation mean? It means very simply we'll save Europe, but we will be your bank examiners. We will examine what you do. We will, of course, have democratic institutions and everything else. But we want guarantees that you will behave yourself to our standards. I understand this. I have a banker too. He always wants to make sure I can pay him back. He's not a nice man. Maybe for his children, yes. But for me, it's always a pain. Germany does not want to dominate Europe. It merely is Europe's banker. And it wants to take from that the position that it deserves. First among equals. And maybe a little more than that. It's a possibility. Your foreign minister, Sikorsky, who I admire a great deal, thinks this is a marvelous idea. I, on the other hand, have bad memories. I understand how things change. And so do many Europeans, Greeks included. This is the decision that Europe faces. Europe now faces the question not of the EU. That question is closed. The question is a new institution in which fundamental questions of national sovereignty would be left to an other entity, however it is framed. Nothing is defined. We have no idea what this entity will look like, but we are assured that it'll be like Switzerland. I don't think so. I think we're dealing with life and death issues for major nation states. They are pursuing their interests and protecting their population. And no simple solution to this is possible. It would be ironic if after 500 years of not uniting, the Europeans finally came together after it was all over. But I don't think they will. I don't think the Europeans will give up sovereignty that quickly, and I don't think sovereignty is a trivial matter in Europe. Because if it were, it would have been given up long ago for better ends. The fact of the matter is that we have seen the return of the nation state already. It is nation states negotiating with nation states that are determining the outcome of this crisis. We've seen war return in a very small way. It doesn't mean that the old nightmares will come back, but it also doesn't mean that they won't. For the one thing that I learned at my parents' table, never underestimate how bad the world can get. You can't go wrong on that. So we have Europe in a transition. The 91-2008 period is over, and something else is coming. It seems to me that what is coming is the nation state, alliances, coalitions, the game of nations. Not horrible wars, I think, but nation states. But perhaps something else will happen. For those who believe it will happen, I will say to you, it's time for it to happen. It's been 3 years. You have been struggling with this question, and the suspicion is growing in the world that you don't have a solution. But if you do have a solution, next week would be a good time to reveal it. Because the global markets are not at ease. The United States, your partner, is wondering whether it has a partner. There are political military issues that have to be settled. And Europe has turned inward. What do I see in the future? I see the nation state. And I see many European countries in decline, countries that have been in decline since 1914 and continue to decline. And I see one country rising, and I can say that I wrote about this 4 years ago, and this is Poland. When I said that Poland would emerge as a great power, I was laughed at uncontrollably, particularly by Poles, who know that there is no hope, and I should stop saying that there is any. Yet, look at the behavior of Poland economically, counter-cyclically to everything that's happening in Europe. This means something. It should be taken seriously. But we're also seeing the decay of NATO, and we are seeing the decay of the EU. As I said before, I may be completely in error. Please fix it, and I'll apologize. But assuming that you can't, let's talk about decay. We are now talking about regional blocs. Free trade can continue, it can be modified. But the question that really rests is, what is the relationship between Germany and Russia? This is an old question and a dangerous one. Germany depends on Russian natural gas. Germany has a place to export technology. The Russians have money, if you can find the bank they hid it in. So there is a relationship, an alternative for Germany. It is the historic alternative. It is one that Germany examined in the 1870s, had to deal with in the 1938-39 period. It is there. And what is also there is Poland. There are two things that I have to say to Poland. Poland has, as its major national strategy, looking for someone else to take care of it. This is not a national strategy. This is hope. Your latest hope is the EU, an entity that cannot even decide the most fundamental questions of solving this crisis you are looking to protect your national security from. It has no army. How will it protect you? It can't make decisions. Poland must now depend on itself. Why? It's a nation of 38 million. It has a vibrant economy. It has highly intelligent, educated people. And it is rising. I will put a more radical idea forward to you, which I think is fundamental, one that we get from General Pilsudski, the intermarium. The intermarium basically says we are caught between Germany and Russia, and that stinks. We would like to move to Sweden, but we can't. So we must become a very difficult morsel to swallow. And we can't become that ourselves. And he proposed the intermarium, an alliance of nations between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Neither German nor Russian, but self-sufficient, and then able to, in his mind, enter into a relationship with France. Because he knew that France could not come if Poland couldn't survive for 6 weeks, for more than 6 weeks. Enough time to be a morsel. How did Switzerland survive? It was easier not to attack it than to attack it. There are nations in Europe who have survived simply by being too much trouble to fight with. Poland must become too much trouble. But Poland must also have a free trade zone with countries who need Polish exports, need to be aligned with Poland, need to be led by Poland. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, even Turkey, are all countries in crisis of various sorts. The interesting thing about Poland is you're not in crisis. When I look at Europe, everyone's in crisis. Poland isn't. There is a moment of leadership here that Poland can undertake in working with the United States to create a stable environment. An alliance with the United States from the Polish point of view consists of what will you give me that I don't have to pay for. That's not an alliance. An American alliance with Poland must be founded on the idea of Poland as a self-sufficient leader in the region that the United States can rely on. We are not France. We will come, but you have to be here. If you all move to Sweden, there's nothing we can do. This last piece is advice that sounds archaic. How can you speak of General Pilsudski? How can you think of the intermarium? How can you think of Polish leadership? The answer is, how can I not? When I see what has happened to NATO, when I see what has happened to the European Union, when I see how Poland is developing, how can I not think this way? Europe is returning to history. The Great Party is over. 91 to 2008 was wonderful. It will not return. A future now has to be made, and for 2,000 years, the future of Europe was built on states. You are living in one of the most dynamic and important states of Europe, and you can help shape it, not by writing position papers and going to meetings, but far more importantly, by taking steps to protect your sovereignty and to assert your power. It is not that what I am saying is archaic. It was that the period of 1991 and 2008 was an anomaly. It was not real. It merely happened, and now is over. I urge you to stop waiting for the good times to come back and to take responsibility for the country you love and whose fate you share in returning to history. But the first thing you have to do, as much as you love Poland, is to believe in it. And the hardest thing to do in America is to convince an American there's anything that's beyond his reach. But in Poland, I must convince you that there's something within your reach. Step back, take a look at your country, take a look at the chaos around you in Europe, and take control of your fate. This is what the next 50 years will look like. It will look like Poland and other countries, committed to their people, to those they love, and making their way. It is a very painful history, but there's no pain that I can tell Poland it will bear that will be worse than what it did. So, history continues, and you will be a leading power in it. You don't believe it, but it's true. Thank you very much.
We have 15 minutes for Q&A session, so please step up to the microphone and ask questions.
Cristiano Pinsauti, European entrepreneur working in Poland with an Italian passport for the last 19 years.
Indeed.
And already this statement maybe clarifies, but we have dined together yesterday. You know that I disagree with you on several things.
Yes, I know you're wrong.
Right. So you will not be surprised, at least. I want to give you another example apart from myself, because in fact, that mysterious European, which you say does not exist, exists, and I know thousands of them. Since I know thousands of them, there must be hundreds of thousands of them. My daughter, 2 passports, French and Italian, born in Italy, lived most of her life in Poland, got 3 masters in 3 different countries, works in a fourth country. And although she is self-sustaining, I still help her in traveling because she travels to so many countries on this side and on the other side of the Atlantic in order to meet her friends, the people she went to school with in the university and in the Lyceum, that she cannot afford all these trips. She really has friends everywhere, including your mother country, and even speaks Hungarian, her 7th language. Such Europeans exist. They are there. And they have hopes, and they think like Europeans. They don't think like Greeks or Germans. And they don't care where they live. They know that they can live as happily as Italians or Frenchmen in Germany or Britain. It's not important, because they feel they are Europeans. And this spirit is not something that it was born yesterday or that we were allowed to have between 2001 and 1991 and 2008. In fact, it's since Monet, Schumann, and Adenauer and De Gasperi outlined Europe. No, excuse me, but what Professor Friedman said is so contrary to the correct interpretation of Europe that it has to be countered.
Ask some other questions.
Then I would like to hear
people.
his answer.
Okay.
But
Please.
allow me to finish. In 2 minutes I will be finished.
But what's the question then?
The question is, how can he answer to what I'm saying? Because what I'm saying is true, and it counters totally what he has said. So let me finish it so that he can answer. The substance is that, in fact, Monet, Schumann, Adenauer, and De Gasperi sold a common market in order to create an idea of Europe, which is going to be completed in the next 10 to 20 years. Like Mr. Wałęsa has said, like Mr. Brzezinski in his way has said, and what is most important, like Mr. Thuman has underlined this morning, it's not that we want, it's not only that we want, but it's that we have. We will have in the next 20 or 30 years to create a federation of European states, because otherwise Europe as such will not exist. And we will be nice restaurateurs and hotel owners for the Chinese and for the Indians. I don't think that this is the destiny that we want as Europeans. So now, give me please a reading of this interpretation of the reality,
in Poland,
which is the reality of my lifetime. I have lived from the Treaty of Rome to today. So.
Thanks.
In Poland, your nobility once spoke only French. The idea that there's a class of Europeans who move about easily from country to country is as old as the idea that capital has no country, that intellectuals have no country, that the workers have no country. The thing that has constantly arisen, not only in Europe and elsewhere, is the falsification of that assumption. In the First World War, the workers discovered they did have countries. The intellectuals discovered in the World War II they had countries. Yes, there's always been a class of people who moved easily from country to country. But it is not the 25-year-old Greek who is rioting, who can't afford the plane ticket. Your daughter is a fortunate woman. He has you as a father, and if I had you as a father, I'd be fortunate if you would like to adopt me. But I am interested in the mass that makes history, that doesn't move about so easily. My father also knew 7 languages. He was born in the Carpathian Mountains. He says, don't shoot me, steal my chicken, in 7 different languages. So you and I will go drinking, and I will show you why you're completely wrong. Good. I think so.
Okay. Let's have another question. Thank you.
Maciej Jamka. In your analysis of Europe, what is really going on, there is one piece which is, in my opinion, missing. This is environment of Europe as such. Because we are not living anymore in the situation that Europe is the center of the world, right, where Europe becomes a periphery of the world. From that perspective, Europeans as a nations share certain common views, a certain observation that they are different than Americans, they are different than Chinese or whatever. And isn't it a basis for the creation of the European quote-unquote nation? Maybe not now, but this is probably beginning. If we think about Americans, they were not a nation from the very beginning. It was a process. Maybe we are just at the beginning of that process, but it will carry on, it will go on.
But that is the test, whether it will go on. So the idea is that those of you who live in the European peninsula share a common identity, of which that's certainly true. You all live in the European peninsula. You are divided by language. You are divided by history. But all of those are not as important as the fact that you're divided by interest. The interest of a Greek in this moment is not the same as an interest of a German. I'm enough of a Marxist, which is not much of a Marxist, to believe that when the political questions on unification are asked, there are details to be answered. And the Europeans, no matter how broad an understanding they have of what it means to be European, something that Nietzsche believed, something that Kant believed, something that has been a part of European culture, when it comes to answering the question, what does that mean that we're part of a European nation? It is difficult to build a nation. We had a civil war, and hundreds of thousands died. And even now, the work of creating a nation is underway. I don't see Europe making the difficult, agonizing choices of nation building. I don't see the shared values. There are shared principles, but the shared values will mean, look, I may be German, but that doesn't make me different from a Greek. So I may be Texan, but that doesn't make me different from a New Yorker beyond cultural things. And the federal government takes my taxes and distributes it as it wants anyway. When you reach that point, then I think this conversation becomes interesting. The conversation of being a European becomes interesting when it hurts, and it's done anyway. Culturally, yes, you're European. And as a Hungarian, know, I can understand every European if I know Hungarian. No, I can't. But I think there is a European idea. Translating it into a European reality is not something that will simply happen. It will be very painful, and I'm not seeing Europe being prepared to bear the pain. I may be wrong, we'll see.
Some other questions?
Mr. Professor, you articulated very well this sense of community based on nation state, but there is one more force that created sense of community in Europe in the past, that was religion. What is the role of the religion, in your view, in current world and in the future world?
I can't answer that for Europe. I have an answer for Poland, where I think religion is an extraordinarily important force, a complex force. But if I would try to understand France in terms of religion, I would have to spend more time talking about the Enlightenment than Christianity. And these are the things that separate Europe and make Poland fairly extraordinary. It was once easy to say that Europe is the place where Christianity rules. It's not clear what rules culturally, but it's certainly not any simple notion of Christianity. Except in Poland, maybe, which makes it interesting. So I see the differences in Europe on the question of religion as more interesting than the unifying principles.
Maciej Filipkowski. I do believe there is a major difference between New York and Six Flags, being a New Yorker. On a more serious note, it took United States over 100 years to create a federal banking system. And it took about 150 years to create a unifying perception of a nation. It took 2 wars and then Vietnam to actually make it a part of US DNA and American DNA. I don't quite believe the faith that you are showing to Europe. The question is it urgency that you're seeing that needs to be done? And another question, building on what was asked about religion, there's a technological change where people, as you call the masses, do communicate much better. So without trouble, they do exchange ideas and they even out. What's your opinion on that?
Well, the Spanish rioters will be twittering the Greek rioters and they'll riot together, I guess. I don't know if it's good or bad. Comparing the construction of the American Republic with Europe, I think, is problematic. In some fundamental ways, the United States was tabula rasa. It was invented from nothing. You are in the middle of 2,000 years of history, I picked that number arbitrarily, attempting to shape a course. When you're hurtling forward in history with very ancient countries, countries with deep animosities, and so on. The memories of Europe can be a crushing weight. America is a country without memories, which at the same time makes it, in a way, barbaric, but free. When I say to a Jew that Germany will play a leading role in Europe, and I say this because I'm Jewish, immediately the stomach clutches. Maybe with Pole too, you never know. There is a deep history of Europe. So yes, it took the United States 200 years to build something. But you have already built something, your nations. They already exist. They function. You don't have people migrating to Europe from Mongolia suddenly creating institutions. You are trying to take ancient, very real entities and mold them into something other than they are. And I would argue this is a problem, a task, much more difficult than the United States faced. But even the task that the United States faced involved, as I said, a civil war, building institutions in the face of the terrible sin of slavery. And that was from a country that was new. When we take the full weight of European history and say, how do we forget that and start again? Which is, in a way, what the EU asked for. I think it is much more difficult than the United States. But if it is only as difficult as the United States, my God, how difficult will it be? And how much time do you have? Because you asked, is there urgency? In Europe, there's always urgency, because the bad memories can come back very fast. You never know what comes. I'm always reminded in 1932, Germany was Weimar, liberal, democratic, free, and weak. By 1938, it was different. How quickly Europe changes is one of its characteristics. How unexpectedly it changes.
Łukasz Urban, I'd like to talk a bit about Poland. You've, in your book, you projected this preeminence to which Poland is destined. Here, on several occasions today, you commented that Poles are sort of skeptical about taking the fate of its country in their hands. Do you see an alternative for this wonderful future for Poland, in case we fail to take the helm?
20th century. And if that doesn't frighten you enough, look at the 19th. So the issue here isn't, this is a wonderful vision. God help you if I'm wrong.
We just have time for two more questions.
Okay, David Monroe, a demographic question that relates to your title, The Middle of the 21st Century. I see Poland as being one of the youngest countries in Europe because their fertility rate did not fall as others did because they were probably occupied. But starting in the early 80s, they went from a fertility rate of 2.5 down to about 1.4 now. And so in 1983, when Lech Walesa won the Peace Prize, there were over 700,000 babies born. And in 1989, there were just over 500,000. And this last year, there were 390. And if we project this fertility out to the year 2050, there'll be 150,000 babies born. So I'm wondering how Poland can maintain a presence in Europe and lead Europe when you have the Scandinavian countries, the UK and France, maintaining their population size, where Poland has an exponential decline in fertility in babies.
Well, I spent the first part of my life being told that the population explosion will destroy us. I am spending the second part of my life being told that the population decline will destroy us. It is a serious issue, but I will also argue that with the end of the 20th century, the age of mass production in advanced industrial countries shifted. Where previously the industries we had were dependent on extremely large amounts of labor, and so were armies. The development of technology has raised the question of what is the relationship between population size, productivity, and per capita GDP. So let's assume for the moment that Poland would have its population slashed in half and its GDP declined by 25%. The net gain for per capita GDP would be enormous. I think that, and I've written in the next 100 years extensively on the population issue, I think the population issue has to be viewed in the context of productivity, new technologies, the number of man-hours that are needed to do various things. So I'm not sure that there is a correlation. I'm saying I'm not sure because I'm not sure. I'm not sure there is a correlation between declining population size and declining per capita GDP and national power. For example, one of the things the United States has shown is it can lose wars with much smaller armies than in the past. And, as a joke. The point being that the mass armies of the 20th century are things of the past. Mass production is being redefined. And I'm not sure that France is going to be better off having a large population, given the technologies it has to support. So let's study that very carefully. It is an issue with Poland, but I'm not sure that if we maintain productivity with new technologies and contract population, we aren't better off in the long run. And that would be something that I want to in my next book study and think about, which is a nice way of putting you off. Thank you.
Thank you very much. George Friedman, ladies and gentlemen.